McGrane.
So, I'm kind of a high-minded idealist about the web. I think that the web is its own medium. It's not print, it's not television. And the values that define this medium, the values that make it great, are its fluidity, its flexibility, its availability. The web can be accessed by people using screen readers or alternate input mechanisms. The web can be accessed by people on fast or slow connections. The web can be accessed on every type of device with a browser. We don't need to splinter and fragment the web in order to get it to work this way. It naturally works that way. Well, as long as we don't break it. The W3C sums up this philosophy by calling it one web. They say that one web means making, as far as is reasonable, the same information and services available to users irrespective of the device that they're using. Now, when you read this, it sounds a little bit like responsive web design. I think that today, responsive web design is the latest skirmish in the battle for one web. With a responsive implementation, you have a single set of content that was delivered up against a single URL. Instead of fragmenting your efforts across a variety of different screen sizes and platforms and devices, your entire team can be pulling together, working against the same release cycle. And as a result, you get more value from your initiatives. This sounds amazing, doesn't it? I mean, why would anybody ever do anything else? Well, sadly, if I've learned one thing in my 20 years of web consulting, ain't nothing ever that simple. Livia Ledbate, who led a large-scale responsive replatforming of Marriott.com, said that she would go into meetings and stakeholders would say, well, I need more than a responsive site. I need it to be adaptive. And the problem is that nobody knows what that means. And yet today we are constantly told that we need to move beyond responsive. We need to move beyond responsive design and optimize our website for mobile users. We need to move beyond responsive design and discover context first. We need to move beyond the responsive web to the adaptive web. This guy says we should move beyond responsive and adaptive to something he calls adjustive web design. I don't know what that guy's talking about. And when you read these articles, they basically all have the same thing, that adaptive is like magic. If you wave your magic wand over your adaptively created website, it will automatically do everything that your users want. So in this talk, I want to outline some different approaches to how people think about publishing to different devices. The first one, you may have heard of it, called responsive web design. The second one, I want to spend some time unpacking what adaptive means. And let's contrast that with our old friend, the M-Dot site, or a separate mobile website. So over this course of this talk, I'm going to go through sort of a model of what this means. But just to make sure we're all on the same page here, responsive design is fluid grids, flexible images, flexible media, and media queries. It was defined in a book and an article by my dear friend Ethan Marcotte. Great guy, you should check him out. In contrast, a separate mobile website, an M-Dot site, is essentially a completely different site that is delivered up against a different domain, often m.domain.com, hence the moniker M-Dot. And the trouble with an M-Dot site is that because it's a completely different website, it often contains different information or less information, or it requires teams to take on the burden of managing and maintaining content across two completely different sites. I think these are all pretty clear, right? I think everybody kind of grasps what a separate mobile website is, and I think most people are familiar with responsive, but what the heck is adaptive? So I'd like to offer a definition of adaptive, unpack some different ways, but I think that at its heart, what adaptive means is that you are serving something different. But when I say you're serving something different, what do I mean? Well, In one sense, one context, people like to talk about adaptive as that you are delivering something different to the type of device. So that may mean that you are tailoring the experience, tailoring the content to the operating system, or to whether the device is a smartphone or a tablet or a desktop, or maybe even tailoring the information and designs that you serve according to the capabilities of the device. There's a second way that people might want to serve something different, and that's by serving something different based on the context of use. Now, I want to offer what I believe is a very specific definition of context. When I talk about context, I mean pulling information from the device sensors that will give you some cues about what the user is doing, or where she is, or what's going on in her environment. So that might be things like the time of day, or information you can get from the location sensors, or even other things that you can pull from the sensors of the device, like the velocity at which that device is going, or the air pressure or the barometric pressure, which might give you a sense of how high the user is, or temperature readings you could get from the device, all might tell you something about the context of use. A third way that people like to talk about serving something different is to actually personalize the experience. So to take information that you might know about the actual user of that device, her age, the person's gender, where they're at in their life stage, are they in college or are they near retirement, what languages they speak, what you might know about their relationships, so are they married, do they have kids, and personalizing that experience for them based on what you know. A lot of smart people today are talking about personalization. I actually want to sidestep that particular conversation and just focus on these first two variables. When would it make sense to actually try to serve something different based on the device that somebody has? Now, to introduce this approach to what adaptive means, I feel like I first have to start out by introducing what is probably the most common definition of adaptive, which is also, just coincidentally, my least favorite definition of adaptive. So in this definition of adaptive, what people mean is that rather than serving a completely fluid, responsive website, they are instead serving a series of fixed-width designs. If you look at this video here, you might note, watch how these boxes expand. They expand completely fluidly in between the breakpoints. A responsive design is 100% fluid, which means that it will neatly adjust to serve any size screen, any type of device in the market. In an adaptive solution, rather than being completely fluid, designers serve what are essentially a series of fixed-width designs that snap into place. If you look how these boxes expand, it feels really jumpy. It doesn't feel fluid. And that's because the design team has essentially been able to imagine that they are delivering a series of fixed-width designs rather than designing their site so that it fluidly accommodates all screen sizes. Now, this approach, here's an example of a prototype for an adaptive design tool that is aimed at 3 of the most common iOS screen sizes, in portrait and landscape. So what you might imagine is that a designer for a native app might have a series of fixed-width canvases, and they could switch between these to see how the designs might adjust for different size screens. That's pretty cool, right? If you're designing native apps. It's pretty not cool if you are designing for the sheer diversity of screen sizes, orientations, browser windows that you will expect to find when you are designing for the mobile web today. So I want to make this clear why this is my least favorite definition of adaptive. I think we should just call this like not completely fluid responsive, or maybe like badly implemented responsive. Let me bring you back to what my definition of adaptive is and highlight this keyword here, serving. So that previous definition of adaptive is something that you can handle entirely client-side. I would like to introduce a definition of adaptive that suggests that what that means is that you need to get the server involved to do something different. Responsive design. First question we want to ask ourselves is, are you serving information into the same URL? So in a responsive site, yes, obviously you are. An adaptive site allows you to also serve different information or different content into the same URL, which sidesteps some of the more problematic issues of maintaining an MDOT. Instead of maintaining 2 completely different websites under 2 completely different domains, you can serve a slightly different experience to people based on the context of that device in that URL. Google has coined the term dynamic serving, which I think is another definition of adaptive. Luke Wroblewski coined the term REST, which stands for responsive and server something. I would argue that that's also a definition of adaptive. Responsive design is client-side, which means that the whole page is delivered to the device browser, to the client, and then the browser changes how the page appears in relation to the dimensions of the browser window. Adaptive design is server-side, which means that before the page is even delivered, the server detects the attributes of the device and loads a version of the page that is optimized for its dimensions and native features. I think it's worth noting at this point that responsive design is Google's recommended approach for building mobile websites. Now, Google's not going to penalize you if you have a well-implemented MDOT or if you implement adaptive solutions like dynamic serving. Heck, Google themselves uses a ton of dynamic serving for their products. If you have the developer talent and the resources of a Google, then by all means, I say go to town on adaptive. But for the rest of us mere mortals out here who are concerned mainly with SEO, it is worth noting that I think there is no organization on the planet that is more invested in the idea that you are going to serve up one set of content against a single domain than Google is. It makes their job of searching and indexing the web that much easier if you maintain one consistent website using responsive design. So, you're serving information to the same URL. What are you serving that's different? Well, one thing that you might want to serve that's different is different design. In a responsive site, you are serving the same design essentially to everyone. In an adaptive solution, you don't have to. And obviously in an MDOT, you probably aren't either. So under what scenarios might you wish to serve different designs to different users based on the device that they have? Well, one time you might want to do that, one way, is to serve a different page under certain context. I worked with a university last year, and they had just done a complete ground-up, soup to nuts, burn it to the ground and start over, desktop-only redesign of their website. And they hired me to come in and consult with them on what they should do on mobile. And so I said, you should build a time machine and go back in time and not have done that. This proved infeasible. So my next recommendation, I did an audit of their website and I said, I think you should do a responsive retrofit. So I think what you should do is go in and recode the front end of this website. So drop in some media queries, drop in some breakpoints, and it'll essentially be a responsive site. It's not going to be perfect by any means, but given that you just did all of this work, I think that will get you the biggest bang for your buck. So I made this recommendation, very reasonable recommendation, I thought, and you could just see this chill come over the room. I mean, people's body language got all hostile and they're just sitting there and I'm like, And I'm like, why? I'm like dragging the browser window closed going, no, you could totally do this. And finally somebody speaks up and they said, well, Karen, you obviously don't understand how political our homepage is. Rhyme. And so the guy says, well, if we go responsive, can we serve a different homepage? I'm like, of course you can. What, do you think Ethan Marcotte comes over to your house in the middle of the night and yells at you for being a traitor to the cause? Like, if literally the only thing stopping you from making the other 11 bajillion pages on your website responsive is that you don't want to deal with the stakeholder politics of how stuff is going to rearrange and flex on your homepage, then cut a different version of that page and we'll all go out for an early lunch. This is the easiest consulting job I've had all year. And I don't even want to make this sound like a cop-out. So no less than Chris Coyier. So Chris Coyier, he of CSS Tricks, he of CodePen, talks about combining responsive templates with separate mobile templates for his own product, CodePen. He said that when they were designing CodePen, there were many, many templates on the site, many pages where it made perfect sense to handle the problem responsively. But he said there were some specific pages, especially in their editor, where they just didn't feel like they could provide the optimal experience for someone on a small screen compared with someone on a large screen if they tried to handle the problem responsibly. And I mean, come on, guys, this is Chris Courier here. If there's anybody out there who could ninja his way through a responsive solution to the problem, it's probably him. And yet they decided that they would be better off serving 2 different versions of that page, incurring a higher maintenance cost for those pages, sure, but to deliver the best experience. But in many cases, I don't necessarily even believe that the problem encompasses the entire page. So in other situations, you might just wish to serve a different component, a different feature to users. Beatport is, I would describe them as like a combination of Spotify and the Billboard charts for electronic dance music. So they are a leading resource for DJs to be able to publish tracks and rate tracks and essentially engage with the community. They recently re-platformed their entire app to be responsive. But the team said they ran into a problem with one specific feature, one very important feature, which was the player. They said the team just really felt like that player wanted to be different on different screen sizes. And so rather than trying to force each smaller screen to accommodate something that they didn't feel it should have to accommodate, they just cut 2 versions of the player. Fidelity, investment bank, come up with a similar situation with, can you guess what it is? It's tables. Right, so tables. Very difficult challenge for people when they're designing responsively or designing for smaller screen sizes. Fidelity ran into a situation where they had what was sort of an industry standard table, like an industry standard sort order to the columns. And they said they ran into trouble figuring out how they were going to deal with that problem responsively. So if they just showed people on smaller screen sizes the first few columns of that table, they would be missing some of the more important columns that actually appeared further to the left, further to the right on the table. So they decided that they would rearrange the columns so that mobile users would get the most important stuff first. But they said then they ran into a problem where because the columns were rearranged, people on larger screen sizes, desktops and tablets, were complaining because the columns were out of order. And so they said, we decided that we would handle that problem adaptively. We cut 2 versions of the table, small form, large form, and then we dynamically serve that up to people based on the type of device that they have. Seems reasonable, right? I'll let you in on a secret, though. Fidelity came back to me and they said, oh, no, we actually didn't need to do that. It turns out we were better off solving that problem using conditional loading. So solving that problem using JavaScript on the client side rather than getting the server involved to try to deal with that adaptively. And my advice there is that, as a rule, I think if the problem you're trying to solve is genuinely a problem with layout, if it is genuinely a problem that you're running into solely based on the size of someone's screen, then you are always better off trying to solve that problem completely fluidly, solving that problem on the client side, solving that problem using responsive design. So if you don't need to get the server involved to solve for these particular design problems, when do you need to get the server involved? Well, it's when you want to serve different content. So for better or for worse, responsive web design serves the same content to everyone. Adaptive content has been touted as a solution for delivering different content in different environments to people. And in most cases, an M.dot site is also serving different content. Now, I am an advocate for responsive web design. I'm an advocate for OneWeb. And I have some concerns when I hear people talk about device-specific adaptive content, that you need to serve different content to people based on the type of device that they have. And when I really kind of dig into my concerns with this problem, I realize that I have literally only myself to blame for this problem. I am the person who popularized the idea of adaptive content. I am the person who's been writing about this for 4 or 5 years now. I popularized a case study from NPR, which they called Catchily Cope, stands for Create Once, Publish Everywhere. It describes their API-based content as a service model in which they can deliver from one core repository of content, different sets of content to different devices. So they can maintain a single article form for their content. And that article might contain a title, a long title, a teaser, a short teaser, multiple images, the body of the title, an audio file. And the website can be like, yeah, give me part of those things. The audio player can come in and be like, no, I don't need all of that. Just give me the title and the audio file and the short teaser. Don't give me any images or anything. I can't do anything with that. I'm an audio player. Mobile website can be like, yeah, just give me a small image for that and no teaser. Mobile apps can call up and be like, yeah, give me these things. They can even dynamically serve content into desktop applications like iTunes, which frankly is just showing off. And when you look at this case study, I think it's pretty easy to see how it has become the poster child for device-specific content targeting. Hey, guess who just went responsive? Oh, it's NPR. Patrick Cooper, who is their head of digital, said, we had a phone website and a tablet website and a desktop website, and we really only maintained the desktop website because we just didn't have enough resources to cover all of those fronts. It just wasn't a tenable situation. So, lest anybody here think that I am standing up and recanting my philosophy that the Earth travels around the sun, I believe deep in my heart that there is a huge amount of value for organization in thinking about their content in more granular, more structured ways. You do need a short title and a long title. You do need a teaser, maybe even a short teaser. You do need your content to be structured into appropriately fielded objects rather than treating everything as one giant blob in which the presentation information is all mixed up. But oftentimes, when I tout the value of this granularity, people naturally make the leap to realizing, well, if I have this sort of structure in my content, then that will mean that I can target that content. That would mean that in the same way that you're saying, create a short teaser and a long teaser, I could create alternate forms of that content that would match certain characteristics, and then I could dynamically target that information based on the device or perhaps the context of use. I have a little confession to make here, which is that basically everything that I know about adaptive content, and really web publishing in general, comes from the fact that I was the only person at my job in the early 90s who knew how to do a mail merge. And I had to do it using WordPerfect for DOS, so you kids and your graphical user interfaces can suck it. But so when people talk about adaptive content, when they talk about their goals for being able to target information, it's really nothing more than a glorified mail merge. Okay, so you have these different fields, you are creating alternate forms of these fields, and then you have some set of business logic that allows you to target information. So if I'm skeptical about the value of targeting information to the device, what about targeting information based on context? So let me remind you again what my definition of context is. So what I'm arguing is that context means pulling information, gleaning information from the sensor of the device, like time or location or velocity or air pressure, and using that to make assumptions about where the user is or what he or she is doing. Now, I gave this talk a while back, and a woman came up to me afterwards and asked a very reasonable question, which said, why is this context? I mean, isn't context like waiting in line? And yes, of course it is. But here's the problem. We got no way of knowing when the user is waiting in line. The only thing that we can know is information that we can actually get back from that device, either about the user or where she is, and then we have to make assumptions about what that means. I have worn hearing aids for the last, 35 years of my life. And today's modern hearing aids are very exciting. If you know anything about hearing aids, so the way they work today is that they come pre-programmed with these different soundscapes. So I have a restaurant program, I have an auditorium program, and one of the things that this particular hearing aid model has is a car program. Now here's what's interesting about this car program. It automatically switches to the car program when the device knows that I'm in a car. How does it know that? Well, the iPhone will monitor speed and will automatically change to the selected program when the iPhone is traveling more than 10 miles an hour. So it is using information that it can get from the device velocity sensor as a proxy for the fact that I'm in a car. But I hope you can see that velocity is a somewhat inaccurate proxy of whether or not I'm in a car. I could be running faster than 10 miles an hour. I could be bicycling. I could be a human cannonball. Of those options, the human cannonball, by far the most likely. So when we talk about people saying that they want to tailor information to the context of use, when I hear what people have to say, to me it often sounds a lot like personalization fanfic. Like, you just hear people basically saying, like, well, wouldn't it be cool if we could scrape people's LinkedIn profiles, and then we'd know what sports teams they're fans of, and then when they check into the Hilton, we'd be able to dynamically target some messaging on their TV to them based on that. That would be cool if we could do that, but we really can't. Scott Lee Ware is a CMS analyst based in New York. He's a great guy. I like him a lot. I presented this slide while he was in the room. He wrote a post a while back called Netflix, You Don't Know Diddly About Context. And so what Scott was arguing was that Netflix, which is fantastic at personalization, is missing the boat on delivering contextual information to users. He outlines a scenario, probably very familiar to the parents in the room. Scott has 3 children, aged 2, 4, and 6. And when he goes out to a restaurant, he likes to give them his phone so that he can entertain them while they're eating dinner. And so what Scott argues is, why can't Netflix know that when I'm in a restaurant that I navigated to using my phone, that what they should serve up is Disney princesses? And why can't Netflix know that when I'm back at home in my man cave that I don't want to watch The Little Mermaid anymore? I have another hypothesis, I have another suggestion for this solution. I would argue that this is a solved problem, and it is called user accounts. Why would you invest in complex and risky and expensive contextual targeting to try to guess what someone wants based on where they're at, when you could solve this problem much more easily just by setting up an account for them? So I think a lot of this discussion of contextual targeting really sits on a foundation of believing that users want different information when they are in different contexts. That, what users really want is for us to try to glean, what does this person want that's different when she's traveling, or when she's in a restaurant, or when she's at the airport, and let's try to dynamically serve that up to her so that she's happier. It turns out that when people actually look at their data, that doesn't turn out to be true. Scott Kelton-Jones, who is the VP of Global UX for Expedia, says, what we've discovered as we do our ethnography research, our lab studies, as we watch the mechanics of our site from an analytics perspective, people make the same decisions regardless of the context. This is a travel site, y'all. This is the most contextually aware information that you can get. And they said when we looked at all of our research and we looked at all of our data, it turned out not to be worth it. Responsive turned out to be the right way to go. Similarly, in an article that I think was basically grown in a lab with the express purpose of annoying me, called Responsive Design is Failing Mobile UX, this author hypothesizes that you should be doing contextual targeting for in-store situations. He says you want to get to know your customers and determine whether they're pre-store or in-store or post-store. You'll need to create a different experience depending on where the customer is in the path to purchase. Now, I'm reading this and I'm kind of like, well, okay, so maybe you're using location-based targeting to determine when the customer is physically in the store, and perhaps delivering up targeted offers or messages or store map and location that will help them out. No. This author says, adaptive design enables the customer to have a customized experience based on the device he or she is using. Optimize the customer experience by tailoring the design and information to the device. Truth is, when people actually look at the data, like if you go beyond what consultants are saying about how you need to tailor experience to the device, it turns out that people don't actually want you to guess what they get on which device. A study by ExactTarget asked people, what is the most important criteria for you when you're evaluating the success of a brand on mobile? 91%, by far, 91% of customers said access to content any way I want it is the most important criterion for them in evaluating whether a mobile brand works. Even more than that, 83% of consumers said that a seamless experience across all of their devices is important to them. And that number goes up to 87% when you talk to people who own both a smartphone and a tablet. And this is played out by other organizations that have also gone through the process of looking at their research and their data. Chris Balt, who is a program manager at Microsoft, who led the responsive redesign of Microsoft.com, says, our data shows us quite plainly and clearly that the behavior of people on mobile devices is really not all that different from the behavior of people on desktop. The things they're seeking to do and the tasks they're seeking to accomplish are really quite the same. So device is always going to be the most inaccurate proxy for context. Don't use device as a way of determining where the user is, what she wants, what her context of use is. You will always be better off using actual contextual variables to make those decisions. So don't treat mobile as if smartphone means I'm in a store. Treat being in a store as I'm actually physically in a store location. Use cues that you can get from the device to try to make better decisions about where the user is and what you might want. But keep in mind that most of those things are going to be risky and probably not worth it. Most of the time, you're going to be better off serving the same information to everyone. Now, in the vast majority of cases, like I'm gonna stand up here right now and say, I think that responsive design will solve 95% of your problems. And so when people come in, when you're in a meeting, your stakeholders come in and they're like, I need more than a responsive site, I need it to be adaptive. I want you to tell them that adaptive solutions are not magic. Adaptive solutions aren't even better. They are just a different set of problems. And if you need them, if you wind up in a situation where, okay, let's say, like hypothetically, you implement a really fantastic responsive website, okay? I mean, you burn it to the ground, you start from scratch, the thing is lightning fast, it works better than any other site you've had, and you come back to me and you're like, Karen, you were right. That solved 95% of our problems. Oh, we still have 5% of our problems. Well, then you are in a better position to start implementing adaptive solutions, to start implementing adaptive designs or adaptive content, to start implementing solutions that are tailored to the device or tailored to the context of use only in the very limited scenarios under which you actually need to do that. I don't ever want to hear anybody say that responsive and adaptive are somehow in competition. They are not. If we're going to solve for all of the problems that we have brought down on humanity's head by adopting all of these new devices and platforms, then we're going to need all of the tools in our arsenal. Adaptive and responsive solutions will work together to help meet your needs. I will leave you with this from Livia Labate, in which she says, it's important to acknowledge that most activities are universal, even if there may also be device-specific needs. By having the web experience unified through a responsive approach, we cover the base scenarios across the board and can later do a better job of handling device specifics. All right, I want to say thank you, but before I say that, if you liked this talk, you are going to love my book, Going Responsive. If you didn't like this talk, the book is still great. There's a lot of other things. Thank you.